And I want to start with a video that I saw a few years back. It's a video made on a train in Japan by a Japanese scientist, and something remarkable happens. As he's filming his ride on the train, he's zooming in, and by zooming in, suddenly it feels like the train is slowing down. And actually the train is still having the same speed, but by just using a different lens and a different perspective, the speed of the train seems to slow down. So what if we are on that train as media organizations, and that changing landscape is speeding next to us? Are there any lenses that we can use to slow it down to get a better perspective? That's what the talk is about. 5 lenses that are ways to look at transformation that might help you give a better perspective, might help you to slow down, to kind of embrace complexity that's around us. But maybe a little bit about myself first. I work at Mediahuis, and I guess you don't know Mediahuis if you're in South America, because we're not active in the Americas. But we are active in Europe. We're actually a fairly large international organization in Europe. We work across 5 countries there. We have a portfolio of more than 30 news brands. We have daily, we reach 10 million users every day, and we have 1.7 million subscribers. So quite a big portfolio of different brands that we bring together. Our mission is very much how to have like a good business that can sustain independent journalism. We have a portfolio of quite local and smaller newspapers as well, and we really believe that we need to find a way to support their journalism and to stay strong and relevant and part of a positive contribution to society. My role at Mediahuis is Change Director. It's a bit of an odd title, but it actually came from the realization that if we make news and if we produce news and the landscape around us, the technologies and the audience behavior is changing, then probably we'd also should think about how we produce that news in the newsroom, and to kind of bridge technology with how the newsroom thinks about and the vision behind their journalism. There is this bridge role, the Change Director, and I do this across the whole group, so across the 35 newsrooms that we have. I tried to find a consolidated view on the kind of technology and platform landscape that we need for those newsrooms. Before, I worked as a head of digital platforms and transformation at the EBU, which is the European Broadcasting Union, so my background is actually broadcast, and I worked with the BBC, France Télévisions, ARD, the big public broadcasters, also to support their transformation. This talk is not about why we need to transform, because I think everybody in the room already knows why we need to transform. There's plenty of challenges and plenty of new changing technologies, changing audience behavior that kind of push us. This is the kind of picture that we strategically within Mediahuis we look at, that we find important evolutions, but that might be different for your organization or for yourself even. A second big driver for us at Mediahuis is our change scale. Since 2014, we quadrupled in size. That means from a local, quite well-run Belgian company, we became a European player, and we're still expanding. We just entered the German market, and I'm quite sure that's not yet the end of it. That means that you cannot operate within the same kind of family structures and kind of constellations. It's not 4 newsrooms that we manage, we're managing many more newsrooms, so we have to think, how can we scale that approach? And then, if you want to transform the company, it doesn't work to have like a kind of fixed plan for it, because the future is uncertain. We need ways that the plan itself is at least adaptable and agile enough to kind of encompass those uncertainties. Look at what happened the last 2 years. Nobody knew that this would happen, and how it changed the way we work, as well as the kind of media behavior that we have. So 5 lenses for media transformation. These are, and they might sound a bit conceptual, and don't worry, I'll try to break them down to practical examples to show you how I use them. They're used to look at an organization, how you transform an organization, but you can also use them to look at a product or even at a journalistic topic and see different perspectives. The first one is moving through scales. And moving through scales means actually just moving and zooming in and zooming out, moving up and moving down. A nice example of this is this movie. I don't know if you saw it. It's online. It's called The Powers of 10. It's a film by Charles and Ray Eames, and it starts with a guy on a blanket in the park. And then you start zooming out, and suddenly you realize he's part of that bigger landscape. He's part of a planet. You're part of a broader galaxy, and you zoom out until you're far out in outer space. And from there, you zoom back in until you're in his hand, in the DNA, in the very essence of his being. And that's what zooming in and zooming out means. So what does that mean on a practical level or in an organization? This is an example of a scale line, something that we use to understand how things are connected. Like an app, a product that you work on has a lower level of the buttons that you make and the very small details, but it's part of a broader ecosystem of things. And once you establish that scale line, it's interesting to understand what part of your company is connected to that. Development and design will work on buttons, product and innovation on the apps. There's marketing and distribution that might think how they will position it in the App Store. Moving up and down that layer, if you're in a part of that company, it's good to scale one up and scale one down to really understand what's happening on the level below or above me. And finally, of course, to understand interdependencies. What is related to what in that scale line? And should we be talking a bit more with each other? Should we understand better how we impact the results of that layers? A very practical example that you all might know, you don't need to scale always 10 scales up and down. This is the business model canvas. Everybody knew it or knows it. It's a way to kind of describe the value that you want to create with your business. Afterwards, they added the kind of environment map to understand this business doesn't happen in isolation. You're part of an environment, and understanding that environment is important to really see if your business model will fit. But then again, the kind of products that you make and the kind of value proposition that you have also has to be connected to that. So that's a practical kind of framework that shows how you can work with scales. In Mediahuis, working with scales means that I have to, within my role, I have to think of how do we scale editorial platforms across all of our titles that we have. That means that I have to have the big picture of the editorial landscape and the architectural kind of integrations that we have in these different countries and kind of find a good mean across that allows us to scale. But on the other hand, I cannot ignore the kind of local needs that some of these titles have and that might have specific repercussions on the solutions that we need. So understanding both really local needs as well as the broader picture is something that I will need to do when we roll out new editorial platforms like we're now rolling out the Q editorial platform and CMS across our group. On a more practical and smaller level, this is something that one of our titles is doing currently in the Netherlands. We have a common data lake and a common kind of reporting and dashboarding that we have across all of our titles. But they said, you know what, looking at those dashboards, they're hanging in our newsroom. For individual journalists, it's not always easy to understand what does it mean for them. So they started with smaller, zooming in a bit, and smaller individual reports for the reporters themselves. Not so much to kind of judge their work, but more to have a kind of understanding. What does this data actually mean for me? How can I improve my reporting? How can I better understand what I make by having these kind of individual breakdowns to working and zooming in on the data? The second lens is swimming upstream. You could also call it inside out. And I think we've heard it already before from Anita as well. It's taking that user perspective rather than the business perspective or the kind of product perspective that we might have. Because we all know the experiences that we are working on, we're thinking about the development of the product, we're thinking about our business, we're thinking about our newsroom, while what the audience is experiencing is something completely different. And we really should take that into account. So that means that you have to reverse the perspective. What's the value that you want to create for your user? And if you work back from that value and take all the steps that you need, what do you need in terms of steps to deliver that value? Rather than, this is how we work and that's how we make value. No, what value do we want to create? And what does that mean for different steps in the process? An example I love and that inspires me is the way Herken actually looks at the story process in a newsroom. Rather than seeing news as an end product that just is delivered to the audience and they can read and consume it. They think the news should be made with the audience, and they should be part of every step of the reporting process, part of the pitch, the assigning, the reporting, and they do as well consulting, I know, as specific tools for the newsroom where audience can actually pitch questions, or they can vote on topics, or they can be part of the reporting process. So involving the audience from the start rather than just being them delivering the end product to them. In our newsroom, something that I try to enforce is taking that user context and the new user context very much in mind. The fact that most of our users are experiencing our news on mobile is something that's not yet completely seeped into our newsrooms. So some of the newsrooms still start with a newspaper in the meeting and discussing page one, while actually most of them, of their readers, are experiencing the news on a mobile phone. This means that in the editorial process, but also in our tooling, mobile first and bringing that kind of user context into the process is very important. That's why it's important that we have mobile first views in our editor, that our desking team that makes and builds the homepage has a mobile first view so they understand the context in which the news will be consumed. Another thing that we're adding right now is editorial article DNA. And article DNA is a much larger project where we try to add contextualized data around our articles. And part of that is working with user needs. Don't know if you're familiar with the user needs model, but it's about that news should cover more needs than just information. It's also about inspiration, connecting people, updating people. But how do you keep track of that? So we've built that metadata panel that you see there on the right. It's maybe not perfect yet, but it allows us to kind of what was briefed and what was planned, as well as how it was written, to kind of monitor that. All the journalists do it. It's quite easy. They need 30 seconds to fill this in, but afterwards it allows us to review our content mix and to see if we're actually making a good balanced out mix or if we maybe have some gaps in our offer. A third one, connecting the dots, and this might be a fairly obvious one. I think the New York Times Innovation Report mentioned that there was still this huge gap between the business and the newsroom. Well, it's still there. I think a recent INMA survey said that the biggest challenge for transformation is still the silos in newsrooms and in news organizations. So coming back to the earlier things that we already did, developing that scale line and also understanding our process, it's then maybe interesting to understand who's involved in those touch points and where are they sitting in your organization? And are they actually talking with each other? Are they connected? And by having that kind of mapping and understanding who's involved in every touch point, you can understand, oh, maybe these people should be more talking with each other, or they should be involved. And that doesn't mean everybody needs to be connected with everybody, otherwise it slows things enormously down, but you need key bridge people on the right spots in your organization. My role is, as I said, a bit part of that. We moved the technology in a group kind of organization 2-3 years ago, and that meant that suddenly technology came a bit out of the newsrooms and became a group thing. This was a huge change for many of the newsrooms who were always used to control everything and to be very agile. They had an idea and they would productize it or they would implement it directly. Of course, this is for us not scalable across 35 brands, so we needed a kind of group structure. But we also needed bridge figures to keep a very close connection with the newsrooms and understand how, as a group, we can actually bridge that technology to their newsrooms. And that's where I come in, as well as colleagues who work on B2C, B2B data, all kind of group structures that we have. What we're also doing is joint product sprints and product developments, and we bring that to the newsroom. So this is a recent example. We're redesigning an app for one of our quality newspapers, a Standard in Belgium, and from the get-go, we go to with the designs and the kind of thinking together in the newsroom, and we evaluate it together with them. And this is a recent example. It's a performance team. I would say I'm still having some questions how it will evolve, because if you're talking about the separation of church and state between business and content, then here you have a mechanism that sits in between and that brings people together from data, content, people that manage the paywall and people that manage the channels, to give you kind of, to bring together new insights, to formulate assumptions and hypotheses, and to kind of give us a better understanding of what might work, as well for the business as for the newsroom. A fourth lens that I wanted to highlight is learning through loops. It's actually a feedback mechanism that helps you grow. And the most simple version of this is actions that lead to outcomes, and then checking with your outcomes if that actions were actually useful or not. Are we doing the right things? There is a double loop if you think about what are the assumptions that we take as starting points for those actions. What insights, what kind of strategies and experiments are we doing to come to those actions? And if the outcomes are negative, should we maybe review our assumptions or not? And then as a triple loop, it's the context. Like, how do we come to our assumptions? What kind of principles, beliefs, and value actually lead that we have certain assumptions? If print is kind of your core starting point, you will never come to mobile-specific assumptions. So you might need a paradigm shift in that context, in the beliefs and the principles to actually come to right actions and right assumptions. Practical example, single loops. We have a system of smart notifications in our newsroom. These are actually kind of small suggestions that monitor articles that are performing good or not good, and suggest meaningful actions, like you should actually post this on Facebook, or this is working very good on Facebook, maybe you should promote this a bit higher on your... So these are tiny loops that actually inform the newsroom and that help us act on that. And of course, everything that we do then is monitored and measured again to see if we have to reiterate that. A second loop is working with assumption. That this is product thinking entering the newsroom. It's understanding that you don't just have to look at data to understand what you did before, but already predicting what might happen in the future, kind of formulating an assumption. We believe that longer headlines will be better than shorter headlines, so we will make longer headlines, and we'll test this by doing this metric, and we are right if after so many weeks we see actually an increase of the click-through or something like this. But this is a very tangible way that you can also do with journalists. Let them formulate assumptions in a way that you might formulate assumptions as product thinkers. A triple loop, and that's shifting the paradigm and shifting the way of thinking, is we're currently developing a mobile playbook. This is a way to, across all of the group, to discuss together with all the editors-in-chiefs and all the people that are involved in the newsroom process, how might we rethink how we work if mobile is the first screen that we want to deliver to. And that's trying to shift that mindset. The final lens, and I'm going over my time, but I'm almost finished, is leveraging the system. This all is actually part of a way of system thinking. And media is a system. It's a complex combination of different elements, and doing one thing somewhere might affect something else very much. I have this belief also about AI in the newsroom, and I will be talking about that in the afternoon in the workshop. You really have to consider the whole system before you start placing AI in newsrooms to understand the consequences. This is actually a picture from that Walt Disney drew in 1957, already understanding how the different parts of his company might find synergies to grow faster and better. So system thinking is not just traditional linear thinking, it's about understanding how parts are connected. There's a whole volume of theories and understanding behind it. If you really want to be inspired, read a book by Donella Meadows. She has this kind of levers for system thinking, but the most important one is actually really on top. It's changing the kind of paradigm, that the biggest lens that you look through, from physical to digital, from centrally-led to distributed, from business-centric to user-centric, because that's the biggest shift that you can make. At Mediahuis, we're also trying to do that exercise. We have launched an impact initiative with 3 big lenses. Journalism that matters, because we really want to make sure that we cover journalism with a diversity of voices and not just from a very narrow perspective, and better reflect our audiences. We want to unlock all the potential that we have. That means equal opportunities and enlarging the pool that we're looking at to make our journalism. and we also think about how we can transition our company in a more sustainable way. One example of making this concrete is our youth lab. This is a low entry point for young talent. The way that we normally used to work with journalism schools and people that came out of university did lead to a kind of newsroom that was not necessarily representative for our audience. And by having a different approach and a lower and a different kind of way into the company, we hope that we can broaden the pool of talent. So conclusion, I hope this somewhat made sense. 5 lenses to look at an organization, a product, a topic. See the whole picture, engage in different perspectives, try new leverage points, look for the connections, question your assumptions, and embrace the complexity of it all.